War doesn't just end lives, it often ends them in ways so brutal, so physically and psychologically agonizing, that the suffering becomes part of history itself. Across centuries of conflict, from ancient battlefields to modern warfare, some deaths have stood out not just for their violence, but for the unimaginable pain endured in the final moments. In this video, we're diving into 5 of the most painful war deaths ever recorded. Stories that reveal the horrifying realities of combat, the cruelty humans can inflict on one another, and the devastating cost paid by those caught in the chaos of war. In September 1944, over a remote stretch of the Pacific Ocean, 9 young American pilots bailed out of their burning aircraft after bombing runs over the Japanese-held Bonin Islands. Below them was Chichijima, a small, isolated island that looked almost peaceful from the sky. But for 8 of those men, the moment their parachutes opened was the beginning of something far darker than they could have imagined. 8 of the airmen, Lloyd Wilhoff, Grady York, James Jimmy Dye, Glenn Fraser Jr., Marv Mershan, Floyd Hall, Warren Earl Vaughn, and Warren Hindenlang were captured by Japanese forces stationed on the island. The 9th pilot, a 20-year-old aviator named George H.W. Bush, managed to evade capture after being rescued at sea. He would go on to live a long life in public service. The others would not. At first, the captured airmen were interrogated. Then they were beaten. Witness testimony later revealed they were tortured while being held by the Japanese garrison. Supplies on Chichijima were running dangerously low as the war turned against Japan. Isolated, starving, and increasingly desperate, discipline within parts of the garrison began to collapse. What followed was not just execution, it was something far more horrifying. On the orders of Lieutenant General Yoshio Tachibana, the 8 American prisoners were executed. Several were beheaded, but even in death, their suffering did not end. Officers within the garrison men entrusted with command took part in acts that would later shock even hardened war crimes investigators. Portions of at least 4 of the victims' bodies were removed and consumed. Some believed, incredibly, that eating parts of the liver would provide strength or medicinal benefits. Others pointed to starvation and deteriorating morale. None of it could justify what had happened. For years, the full truth remained buried beneath the silence of defeat. But after Japan's surrender, investigators uncovered evidence of the killings and cannibalism. What had happened on that isolated island could not be dismissed as battlefield chaos. It was deliberate, ordered, and carried out with participation from ranking officers. In August 1946, Tachibana and several others were put on trial for war crimes. International law at the time did not specifically address cannibalism, so the charges focused on murder and the denial of honorable burial. Testimony laid bare the grim details. Ultimately, Tachibana and 3 other officers were convicted and executed by hanging. Other personnel received prison sentences, though many were released within years. Another senior figure connected to the garrison, Vice Admiral Mori Kunizo, initially received a life sentence. He was later tried separately for other war crimes committed in the Dutch East Indies and was ultimately executed. The Chichijima incident stands as one of the most disturbing episodes of the Pacific War, not simply because men were killed, but because of what happened after. It forces us to confront a brutal reality. In war, when order collapses and humanity erodes, the line between soldier and savage can disappear with terrifying speed. And perhaps the most haunting part is this: one parachute drifted to safety that day. One life was spared. History would remember him for decades to come. But 8 others vanished into one of the World War II's darkest chapters, their final moments unfolding on a quiet island that would forever carry the weight of what happened there.
World War II was the largest and deadliest conflict in history. Historians say 127 million people were mobilized into military service around the world.
Between 1939 and 1945, the world didn't just go to war, it unraveled. When we talk about World War II, we're not talking about a distant battlefield or a single front line. We're talking about a conflict so vast that it swallowed continents, reshaped borders, and erased entire generations. By the time the guns finally fell silent, an estimated 60 to 75 million people were dead. To put that into perspective, that was roughly 3% of the entire global population at the time. Imagine 3 out of every 100 people on Earth simply gone, and not all of them died holding a weapon. World War II became the deadliest conflict in human history because it blurred, and often erased, the line between soldier and civilian. Yes, millions of troops were killed in combat, but even more civilians perished, many far from any traditional battlefield. Entire cities were reduced to ash by strategic bombing campaigns. Families starved as supply lines collapsed. Prisoners wasted away in camps. And in one of history's darkest chapters, 6 million Jews were systematically murdered in the Holocaust, alongside millions of other victims targeted by the Nazi regime. Direct combat deaths are estimated between 50 and 56 million. But the devastation didn't stop with bullets and bombs. An additional 19 to 28 million people are believed to have died from war-related famine and disease. Hunger became a weapon. Blockades strangled nations. Crops failed. Infrastructure crumbled. In places like China and the Soviet Union, starvation claimed millions of lives, often quietly, without headlines or memorials. Civilian deaths alone are estimated at 50 to 55 million, more than the total military deaths of many wars combined. Military fatalities from all causes totaled around 21 to 25 million, including roughly 5 million prisoners of war who died in captivity. For countless families, there was no final goodbye, just a telegram or silence. Some nations bore losses so catastrophic they still echo today. More than half of the total deaths occurred in the Republic of China and the Soviet Union. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, newly opened archives forced historians to confront even higher numbers. Russian government figures now place Soviet losses at around 26.6 million people, including 8 to 9 million who died from famine and disease alone. That is not just a statistic. It is entire cities' worth of lives erased. Poland lost between 5.6 and 5.8 million people, according to research by the Polish Institute of National Remembrance. Germany's military dead and missing were later estimated at 5.3 million by historian Rüdiger Overmans, including hundreds of thousands conscripted from territories outside Germany's pre-war borders. The Soviet Red Army inflicted the majority of Wehrmacht losses, turning the Eastern Front into one of the most brutal killing grounds in history. China places its war dead at approximately 20 million. Japan reports around 3.1 million casualties. Across South and Southeast Asia, in Dutch, British, French, and American colonies, an estimated 7 to 10 million people died, many from famine directly linked to wartime disruption. In India, Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines, hunger moved through villages like an invisible army. Even now, historians argue over the numbers. The authors of the Oxford Companion to World War II describe casualty statistics as notoriously unreliable. And they are. Some deaths were never recorded. Some bodies were never identified. Some entire communities disappeared without documentation. The chaos of total war makes clean accounting almost impossible. Take the Battle of Tarawa, for example. In just 76 hours of fighting, over 1,000 U.S. Marines and approximately 4,600 Japanese troops were killed on a tiny Pacific island. Now multiply that scale of carnage across Europe, Africa, Asia, and the oceans for 6 relentless years. And then there are the deaths that don't fit neatly into military or civilian categories. What do you call a child who dies of starvation because a railway was bombed? A prisoner who succumbs to disease in captivity? A family wiped out in a retaliatory massacre? War doesn't care about definitions. It simply consumes. For countries like the Soviet Union, China, Poland, Germany, and Yugoslavia, the losses were so immense that scholars can often only estimate total population decline, then attempt to separate military deaths from genocide, famine, forced labor, and occupation brutality. In many cases, 19 to 25 million famine-related deaths are omitted from simpler tallies, but they were no less caused by war. World War II was not just a clash of armies. It was industrialized death. It was genocide carried out with bureaucratic precision. It was cities firebombed into infernos. It was prisoners marched to exhaustion. It was disease spreading through overcrowded camps. It was hunger turning fertile land into graveyards.
The Mongol Empire was the largest contiguous land empire in human history. From Korea to Hungary, from Siberia to the Persian Gulf, its reach reshaped entire continents. But it began with scattered tribes fighting for survival on the steppe.
In 1206, on the windswept steppes of Mongolia, a man named Genghis Khan united warring tribes under one banner. What followed was not just the rise of an empire, it was the beginning of a storm that would sweep across continents. Over the next century and a half, Mongol armies thundered out of the grasslands and into history. By the time the conquest slowed, an estimated 40 to 60 million people were dead. Let that settle in for a moment. In a world with a far smaller global population than today, that number represented a staggering share of humanity. Some historians believe entire regions lost such a high percentage of their people that the demographic scars lasted for generations. The Mongol Empire eventually became the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever seen, stretching from the Pacific Ocean deep into Central Europe. At its height, it encompassed lands that today include China, Korea, much of the Middle East, parts of Eastern Europe, and vast swaths of Central Asia and Russia. It was not an empire of ships and distant colonies. It was an empire built on horseback, fast, mobile, relentless. And when the Mongols arrived outside a city's walls, the choice was often brutally simple: surrender immediately or face annihilation. Cities that resisted were sometimes erased. Chronicles from Persia, China, and Eastern Europe describe streets running with blood, populations slaughtered, and survivors driven into exile. Major cultural and economic centers, places that had taken centuries to build, were reduced to ash in a matter of days. The psychological warfare was deliberate. News of total destruction traveled ahead of Mongol armies, convincing some cities to surrender without a fight. Terror itself became a weapon, but the deaths were not confined to the battlefield. In fact, many of the millions who perished never saw a Mongol soldier. As cities burned and irrigation systems were destroyed, agriculture collapsed. Famine followed. Trade routes were disrupted. Entire regions were destabilized. Disease spread among displaced populations. When you destroy the infrastructure that feeds and sustains millions, death lingers long after the cavalry has ridden on. The scale of the devastation is almost impossible to comprehend. The conquests affected close to 22 million square miles of territory, an expanse comparable to more than 200 modern countries combined. From the sack of cities in Central Asia to invasions into the Middle East and Eastern Europe, the violence reshaped the political and demographic map of Eurasia. And yet, the Mongol expansion was not random chaos. It was driven by extraordinary military organization and strategy. The Mongol cavalry moved with unmatched speed, coordinating attacks across vast distances. Campaigns were often launched during warmer seasons, when the grasslands could sustain their enormous herds of horses. Interestingly, the rise of Mongol power was preceded by a period of unusually warm and wet climate conditions between 1211 and 1225, ideal for horse breeding, which may have helped fuel their rapid expansion. Even nature, it seems, played a role. By 1260, the empire had reached its greatest territorial extent, but cracks soon began to form. Internal divisions split the empire into separate khanats. Still, Mongol influence endured for centuries. In China, Mongol rule continued under the Yuan dynasty into the 14th century. In Persia, successor states carried Mongol political traditions into the 15th century. In India, the later Mughal Empire, whose very name echoes Mongol, would last into the 19th century. Yet, for all the administrative systems and trade networks that later developed under Mongol rule, the memory of the conquests themselves remains drenched in blood. Historians consistently rank the Mongol invasions among the deadliest episodes in human history, not just because of the raw numbers, but because of how quickly entire societies were shattered. The Mongol conquests were not a single war, but a cascading wave of campaigns that unfolded over decades. They remind us how fragile civilizations can be when confronted with overwhelming force, and how the consequences of conquest extend far beyond the clash of swords.
There are still many questions and very few answers. But today is a day of mourning as the fallen soldiers make their final journey home.
It was the night of April 17, 2002, and the Afghan sky was pitch black. On the ground near Kandahar, soldiers from the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry were carrying out a live-fire training exercise. It was routine, controlled, authorized, the kind of preparation soldiers repeat over and over to stay sharp in a war zone. They fired at designated targets, anti-tank weapons flashing in the darkness, machine guns cracking across the desert air. To them, it was just another drill before the real fight. High above, 2 F-16 fighter jets cut through the night. The pilots, Major William Umbach and his wingman, Major Harry Schmidt of the United States Air National Guard, were heading back from a grueling 10-hour patrol. They were exhausted. The cockpit was dim, the steady drone of the engines mixing with scattered radio chatter. After hours in the air, fatigue dulls the edges of judgment. Every flicker below can feel like a threat. Then they saw it, flashes of light from the ground. To the pilots, it looked like surface-to-air fire. In a combat zone, you don't ignore flashes in the dark. You survive by reacting first. Major Schmidt's voice came over the radio, tight and urgent. He requested permission to engage. "I'm rolling in self-defense," he said, convinced hostile forces were firing at them. But there was hesitation from above, a warning. "Let's make sure it's not friendly." The instruction was clear. Hold fire. Seconds stretched. The tension was suffocating. Schmidt didn't wait. A 500-pound laser-guided bomb dropped from the F-16, slicing silently toward the earth. 22 seconds later, the Afghan desert exploded in a blinding fireball. The blast ripped through the Canadian training position, turning a controlled exercise into chaos. Dust, smoke, screams. When the debris settled, 4 Canadian soldiers were dead. 8 more were severely wounded. They were not Taliban fighters. They were not enemy combatants. They were allies, partners in the same war effort. It was the first time Canadian soldiers had been killed in combat since the Korean War, and it had happened at the hands of a friendly aircraft. The shock was immediate. How could this happen? How could Allied forces mistake each other for the enemy? Investigations followed on both sides of the border. Canadian officials concluded their troops had followed procedure. The exercise had been properly approved. Safety protocols were in place. The tragedy, they argued, came from the air. American investigators found that protocol had been broken. The pilots had been told to hold fire. That command had not been followed. Assumptions were made under pressure. Fatigue played a role. Communication between Allied forces was flawed. Coordination failed at multiple levels. Major Harry Schmidt later issued a long and emotional apology. He expressed remorse, but for the families of the fallen, apologies could not replace what was lost. Back home in Canada, grief settled heavily over military communities. Years later, the pilots faced consequences. Major Umbach was formally reprimanded for leadership failures and allowed to retire. Major Schmidt was found guilty of dereliction of duty. He was fined and officially reprimanded. A superior officer wrote bluntly, "You acted shamefully. You blatantly ignored the direction to hold fire." In the summer of 1914, Europe looked powerful and civilized. Its cities glittered with electric lights. Its empires stretched across continents. Leaders spoke confidently about progress and destiny. But beneath that surface, tension was building. On July 28, 1914, after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand by Gavrilo Princip, Europe plunged into war. Many believed it would be short, over by Christmas. Instead, it became a 4-year catastrophe that killed an estimated 15 to 22 million people and wounded around 30 million more. At the time, it was simply called the Great War. No one yet imagined a second. 2 massive alliances faced off: the Allies, Britain, France, and Russia, and the Central Powers, led by Germany and Austria-Hungary. What began as a regional Balkan crisis spiraled into a global conflict stretching across Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and beyond. On the Western Front, the war froze into a nightmare of trenches from the English Channel to Switzerland. Soldiers lived in mud and fear, under relentless artillery fire. Machine guns cut down entire waves of men in seconds. Poison gas drifted across no man's land. At Verdun, the Somme, and Passchendaele, hundreds of thousands died for ground measured in yards. Warfare had become industrialized slaughter. Civilians suffered just as deeply. Naval blockades caused starvation. Entire populations were displaced. In the collapsing Ottoman territories, genocide unfolded. Disease spread rapidly through crowded camps and cities. And in 1918, the global movement of troops helped fuel the deadly influenza pandemic, claiming millions more lives. The war's roots lay in rising nationalism, imperial rivalries, and a fierce arms race. Germany's growing power unsettled Europe. The Balkans became known as the powder keg of Europe, where competing ambitions and alliances made conflict almost inevitable. Once the first shot was fired, declarations of war followed in rapid succession. In 1917, the United States joined the Allies after German submarine attacks on Atlantic shipping. That same year, revolution in Russia brought the Bolsheviks to power, pulling the country out of the war. In 1918, Germany launched a final offensive, but ultimately collapsed under the Allied counterattack. One by one, the Central Powers surrendered. On November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m., the guns fell silent. But peace did not mean stability. The 1919 Treaty of Versailles imposed severe penalties on Germany. Empires dissolved. New nations formed across Europe and the Middle East, many burdened with fragile borders and deep resentment. The League of Nations was created to preserve peace. It failed. World War I shattered the illusion that modern civilization guaranteed safety. It proved that industrial power could produce destruction on an unimaginable scale. When people called it the war to end all wars, they were speaking from exhaustion and grief.